This brief yesterday to a group of 30 visitors to NPS from Egypt. I had 3 translators there translating everything. They had this whole brief in their language, and it was really interesting having to say just a few words and then have it translated. I haven't done that in quite a while, so that was a lot of fun. But it's the exact same brief, so they were very interactive. It ended up going from an hour to 2 hours, and then I took them outside and showed them some of the toys, and they all came outside and I set up a network. And I'm going to offer to do that at the end of today too, if you're interested in that, to see how fast we can set up a hastily formed network. Okay, next slide. So this is my agenda. I'm going to cover the first 3 things there. I won't get into the research topics unless some of you want me to, and depending on how time goes, we can talk about a few of them, or please feel free to go offline with me anytime. I'll make sure you get business cards. Next slide. So, I'm going to do the textbook definition of hastily formed networks first, and then we'll get into the fun stuff. This part is the most boring, I promise. So, hastily formed network consists of 5 things. I assume you can see this in the back. So I'm not going to read very many slides verbatim, but this one's so short that I am to make the point, okay? 5 elements. A network of people or technologies established rapidly from different communities. Those communities could be virtual or physical. It could be here or there. Working together in what we call a shared conversation space. And I'm going to explain what that means in a little while. But what we're trying to do is plan, commit to, and execute actions to fulfill a large, urgent mission. Okay? Next slide. We need to have 4 skills that we need to learn. First, we need to learn how to work at what we call the civil-military boundary. Is that a new term to you all? Anybody here not know what civil-mil boundary is? Okay, good, about half of you. That's good that half of you do know that term. Now we'll be 100% after today. That means the military community working with the non-military community of early responders in this case. So your FEMA, your Coast Guard, your UN, your non-government organizations, fire department, police department, all of those non-military early responders sometimes have difficulty working with the military early responders because for several reasons. One is we have different agendas, we have different biases, we have different language. So if I say to somebody from the fire department, we need a water buffalo, they're going to say, where am I going to find a big animal with horns, right? And in the military, a water buffalo is a big container that is filled with water that you take out to the field. So that's just an example of how semantics and language can really affect the delivery sometimes. We also want, yes ma'am?
So in the first slide, when you're using your definition, you're talking about urgent missions. Urgent defined by whom?
Well, it could be defined by the leadership. It could be defined by simply the number of people in need of rescue, like search and rescue, digging people out of rubble. Could be saving lives. Any reason why we need to get out there and set these networks up there quickly, we've encountered.
So it's not just a military definition?
Definitely not.
Or government?
Good point, definitely not. This whole concept of hastily formed networks is not a military-centric concept. The UN and the NGO community who do communications in disasters, they try and get as fast of a network up as they can in a disaster too. Because one thing's clear, in every disaster, what's the first thing that every early responder or victim or volunteer, the 3 categories of people in a disaster, what's the first thing they need to do?
Evaluate. Assess the situation.
That's one of the first things. How are they going to know what to assess?
Set up communications.
That's what I was looking for. Yeah, if we can't communicate, we can't operate. If we can't communicate, we can't coordinate. We can't cooperate. And Eric's going to talk about some 4 C's, so I won't steal his thunder with the 4 C's. But that's critical. Then we need to learn how to improvise. I think in the bottom of my bag of tricks here, I have a roll of duct tape. That's what I mean by improvising. We need to go, if we need to set up an antenna for a network, we're gonna go out and find the nearest telephone pole and survive the storm, or the top of a building, or a rigid tree or something, and take that antenna on top of that. We use what we can, what we have available to us in austere environments, and that's what I mean by improvising. The last thing is the hardest thing to find in a major disaster in a network: leadership. You have a, well, right now there's a Cyclone Pam hitting Vanuatu in the South Pacific. Who's in charge once that disaster finishes its destruction? Who's in charge after that of the response? I ask you. The UN? United States? New Zealand, who's nearby, who always responds to them? Nobody knows? Who's in charge? Yes, sir.
Whoever shows up.
That happens sometimes. That's not the right answer right now. No, the right answer is the host nation government is always in charge in their country of everything that happens. So they have to ask us, first of all, to go to respond to a disaster. They have to ask us through the State Department channels. And the State Department, through USAID, Agency for International Development, tasks the military to go respond and do the military thing. But in a major disaster where the government of the country is decapitated or incapacitated, like happened in Haiti after the earthquake there several years ago, sometimes it's an ad hoc. Whoever shows up and has the biggest toys and resources ends up being in charge. And that's kind of what happened in Haiti. There was a UN peacekeeping operation going on in Haiti for about 7 years before the earthquake hit Haiti. 1,000-person UN peacekeeping force. In the earthquake, in the 1 minute of the earthquake, at 8 o'clock in the morning that day, 10% of them died, including the top 2 people from the UN. They were crushed in buildings. So there was no leadership, and the country's palace was collapsed. So the main government people died or were unable to respond or communicate. So there was a void in leadership. The UN was completely unable to communicate between Geneva and New York and Haiti. The Haitian government was unable to communicate with anybody because a lot of them were either dead or they didn't have a way to communicate. Literally, they didn't have a cell phone or a radio or anything like that. So what ended up happening is the U.S. came in the first 24, 48 hours, and we had a second-class Navy petty officer sit in a chair with an umbrella at the one airstrip that survived the earthquake and was directing air traffic in within 24 hours. And then we stationed an aircraft carrier off the coast and our big hospital ship off the coast, and you'll see a picture of that, and we kind of took over until we helped the local government figure out, the national government, how to figure out how to take the reins. So the point there is leadership is very hard to come by. Next slide. So we want to try and obtain this medium where all the communications can take place. Again, could be physical, could be virtual. We also need to have rules. We also have to have rules of engagement, rules of interaction. Like, do we have a rule in here where you have to raise your hand to talk, to ask me a question? No, but I could say that's my rule, but I don't. So it's that kind of rules that we're talking about. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that conversation space earlier. We try and build a conversation space, use existing conversation spaces, and there are 3 aspects of that: physical, community, and practices. And you can see the sub-bullets under those. We're going to focus today on the communication systems primarily, but all of these play. The communities, players, organizations is critical in a disaster response. The international responder community oftentimes doesn't know how to interact with others who appear that they haven't worked with before, for example. So that's difficult to do. And I talked about the rules earlier. Next slide, please. So I came up with this 9-piece puzzle to depict everything that's needed to deploy a communications hastily formed network. And now I'm going to take a chance and I'm going to try and go online, because Murphy's Law always strikes when you try and do that. Because I want to show you that there's an interactive version of this and a bunch of other resources at my HFM website. So bear with me for 1 minute. I'm going to show you how easy it is to find that by going to our favorite Google. Oh, good. Okay. So I'm going to type in HFN and MPS. You Google it. And look at that, there we are. So I'm going to go down to the second one that's listed there. And you'll see a website loading, and this is basically our entire Hurricane Katrina response animated with a timeline put online where people can go see how we deployed a hastily formed network in a major disaster. So this was in August, September. What year? Anybody remember?
2005?
2005. Okay, so under there, there is an animated set of slides with me narrating, but I'm more interested in taking you to this interactive puzzle. So here's the puzzle. Now I have some animation. So in the very center of this puzzle, the very center is satellite communications and access to the internet. That's the keys to the kingdom. In a hastily formed networks in an austere environment where nothing works, ground communication-wise, copper, fiber, cellular, radio, none of those work, then you've got to get access to the broadband internet. The only way to do that is going up via satellite. You want to click on that? There are two kinds of satellite connections. One's called VSAT, one's called BGAN. You want to arrow mouse over the 1 and 2 and 3? Okay. So number 1 there is a satellite broadband internet access device called a BGAN. That is bag of tricks. That's what this is. This is a satellite broadband internet access device that fits in a backpack that I can lift with 1 finger. With other stuff too. So this gets me online within 5 minutes at 200 to 300 kilobits per second. So like a slow home internet connection for about 5 to 6 people with a 100-meter Wi-Fi cloud around it. That's a very powerful device. Very inexpensive for the equipment. The service is expensive, but in a disaster, usually the federal government or somebody funds that kind of thing, so we don't care too much about it in a disaster situation where lives are at stake and pain and suffering of victims is at stake. Yes?
Real quick on the cost of service, is it something that, like a prepaid, that available for somebody to have that and go ahead?
Yep, there's a SIM in there, just like your cell phone.
So you don't have to pay a continue? You could, but
If
you
you
don't
use
have
up
to
the
pay a
SIM,
continue.
If you use up the SIM, then you gotta go over them and refresh your SIM or get a new SIM.
But you can buy it once and leave it.
Yes,
like that.
and if you don't use it for a year, that SIM's still good in most plans. A year later, you gotta make sure of that, though. That's a good question. Sometimes people buy SIMs for satellite phones or BGANs, Broadband Global Area Network, that's what that device is called. And they buy the service and they don't use it for a year because there's no disaster for their satellite phone or their broadband internet access device, and it expires and they just wasted, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So you want to make sure you have a plan that doesn't allow that to happen. So that's the small form factor, very easy to set up, kind of small pipe or low bandwidth, low throughput solution. Yes, sir.
What's the battery life?
So that battery in there will last 6 to 8 hours, but we can stick a solar panel on there, and if there's sun, we can allow it to last a lot longer.
Is Hughes the only carrier of that? Hughes is this.
Hughes isn't the carrier, Hughes is one of the manufacturers of the equipment.
But for the service.
The service, the company is called Inmarsat, and they're the only game in town.
Inmarsat.
So Inmarsat is a satellite service provider. They have a network or constellation of satellites that covers the whole globe. That's why this is called Broadband Global Area Network. This device, BGAN, BGAN. Yes, ma'am.
I noticed there was a compass on it. Is there, yeah, what was the purpose of that?
So when you set it up, you need to know what direction to point to the satellite. So you turn it over and there's a compass on there and you go like this. You know what, there's some software you get to know what that compass direction is. That you have to aim it. And so then you aim it at that direction, and then you also have to tilt it properly, which is called azimuth, or elevation. So this is azimuth, and this is elevation. You have to make those two adjustments to that. And then a little chirper, beep sound comes, and it beeps faster and faster when you're better and better aligned with the satellite. So it's one of the alignment tools. Okay.
So, Brian, is this something that's done pre-catastrophe or post-catastrophe that you bring it in for both?
Okay, so there are two kinds of catastrophes. One is zero warning, and another is a catastrophe that you know is coming. Weather events, you know ahead of time that something's happening. An earthquake, you don't. So if there's a weather event coming and you know it's going to be a bad storm, then you want to pre-position this kind of stuff out of harm's way but nearby, or safely in the disaster zone, but safely in something that's not going to get flooded or blown away or something like that. So, but you want to be prepared ahead of time with all this equipment, with training, with the service purchased, because once you get to the disaster zone, there's no communications. It's very hard to call somebody to get service on something like a satellite phone or a BGAN device or hard to get any kind of service when communications is down, right? So you have to be prepared in that way. Slide 2 or picture 2. So that was BGAN, that's small. This is VSAT. Those are kind of what you think of when you think of satellite, right? That's a satellite dish or satellite terminal. That is much bigger throughput, a bigger pipe out to the internet for 25, 50, 100 people or something like that can get access to the network. And the third one, you'll see a VSAT terminal with alternate power powering it. This is in the Philippines several years ago at an exercise. But there's a bunch of solar panels in the back powering a satellite dish. Okay, so if you go back to home on the other side. That gets the main puzzle, and then go over to Wi-Fi mesh. So the three puzzle pieces in the middle are all your wireless technologies. The second wireless besides the satellite is this Wi-Fi mesh. So you have a Wi-Fi mesh here on your campus. You can walk around the campus with your smartphone, your tablet, or your laptop, and get on the internet, right? And you can walk from here to the other building that I accidentally went to today, thinking that we were in that building. It sounds similar. And stay online, right? That's because you have a Wi-Fi mesh. You have a whole bunch of Wi-Fi access points around. There's one in this room right there. A whole bunch of those around. Each of them creates a Wi-Fi cloud around it, and they're overlapping. So you can walk between them and still stay connected. That's what we mean by a Wi-Fi mesh. So in a disaster, we will actually set that up. So this is Hurricane Katrina. This is a Walmart parking lot. We use the telephone poles that survived, or the light poles actually that survived, and we put wireless mesh access points around. And each of them cover a 500-meter diameter, and we overlap them. We create a Wi-Fi mesh. Then we were able to set a tent up and put a table in there, and put some laptops and some voice over IP phones. on a table and let the victims and NGOs and volunteers get online, make phone calls. Because we set up this Wi-Fi mesh that's connected to the internet via that satellite. So these two connect together. Okay? And let's go back to WiMAX. So WiMAX is another wireless technology. This is a wireless bridging technology. And it is a tool that enables you to connect different separate Wi-Fi clouds together and share the same satellite connection out to the internet. And I'll show you a Google Earth picture of how we did that in Hurricane Katrina in Bay St. Louis and Waveland, Mississippi, to create multiple Wi-Fi clouds with one satellite connection, and it'll be much clearer. So that, I mean, the equipment looks like that. We try and improvise and find a tower on one end of the link and a tower on the other end, or something high, because this is direct line of sight. Antennas need to align and point to each other to create this wireless bridge from point A to point B. Maybe a few kilometers, maybe dozens of kilometers. We can go up to 25, 30 miles for one link between these WiMAX radios. I didn't bring a WiMAX radio with me, but they're pretty straightforward, about the size of a pizza box. The antenna and radio is about the size of this BGN device. Let's go up to the upper left, power. So when you bring all this equipment in, we have to assume that there's no surviving grid power. So we bring in our own power, either generators, but if you bring in generators, then you got to have fuel, access to fuel, and sometimes fuel isn't available because either it's been contaminated or there's no power to pump the fuel out of the tanks in the gas station. You know, we've had all that happen to us before, so we bring alternate power like this. Mouse over those. So there's a small portable to run some of your smaller devices, and then, you know, big solar panels to run things like satellite dishes. Okay, apps and comms up on the top middle. So once you have the internet, you have your Wi-Fi clouds, you have your WiMAX linking them together. That now enables us to use all the tools that we normally use every day at work or at play or at school. You know, web, email, teletraining, telemedicine, video teleconferencing, voice over the internet, chat, you know, Facebook and Twitter and all that stuff. So there's, you know, some of the examples of using those technologies or using those applications once you have the network up and running. Very powerful in a disaster zone to be able to do those kinds of things. Environmental support at the top. So then again, this is all accessible and much more on this webpage. Yes, sir.
Just a question about the bandwidth. Once you get, how do you, I'm sure there's not one answer, but I'm sure it's also important. When you start to get the data flowing, like how do you allocate bandwidth, or how do you make that
Good question.
choice or limit?
Yes, so even before that question is who do you allow access to the network? Because the more people you add to the network, the more traffic you put on the pipe out to the internet, and the more clogged it gets and the slower it gets. So you've got to control access to the network, and then once on the network, you have to control how people use the network. So if you have, on a BGAN here, 200 to 400 kilobits per second, if you have 2 or 3 to 5 people doing just text, no problem. If 1 or 2 of them is also doing sending photos or MRIs, like that one there, over the network, they'll still be okay. A little bit slower, but okay. But if people start streaming Netflix on there, everything comes crashing down, right? So you've got to be careful, and we put out what we call an acceptable use policy, one way or another, to get the word out to people not to do that. When we set up our network in Hurricane Katrina with the big satellite dishes and big Wi-Fi clouds, the early responders started to take their cameras and videoing them doing their job. And then they put that over the network to show their family back up in Seattle or wherever. And that really killed the network to the point where we had to completely shut it down and educate everybody. In the middle of a disaster, we had to shut it down and educate people because the network wasn't working at that point. It was broken. They're fragile. Hastily formed networks are fragilely formed networks as well. Let's do voice comms. Oh, shelter, I didn't tell you shelter. So shelter is just, you need to shelter your people to deploy this stuff and, feed them and provide them security and safety and water and medical care. So they set up these disaster camps to do that. Okay, voice comms. So one of the first things an early responder is going to ask for or say they need to, one of the first things they're going to say they need to do is, I need to talk. I need my voice comms back. If my cell phone doesn't work, my push-to-talk UHF, VHF radio doesn't work, then they're pretty much like a fish out of water. They don't know how to do their job. So we bring in the tools to allow them to communicate over the internet. So this is an internet cafe we set up in an elementary school in St. Louis, Mississippi after Katrina. There's a internet cafe at a Walmart, or Kmart, I guess it was in this case, parking lot. So we set up laptops, we set up phones that work over the internet called VoIP, VoIP, or Voice over IP phones, and provided power to. And this is kind of all the devices that can be used now. So you have that satellite broadband and the Wi-Fi mesh. Yes, ma'am.
So in cases where, like for example, hurricanes, I grew up in Florida, so it's all about hurricanes. And they're yearly and you watch them destroy all the islands before they come to you and they move. But they're also followed by tornadoes and bad weather. It doesn't just come and go, or earthquakes with multiple aftershocks. So how do you protect your equipment for people? Or is it just kind of that, wait till it stabilizes?
Well, no, we have to go in, we have to get communications up if people are dying or
Yeah.
trapped in rubble or whatever, or, sitting on top of their roof waiting to be picked up by helicopter. So we need to go in. So, and we need to protect our people, we need to worry about safety and security, particularly in a war zone. Disasters happen in war zones. Disasters happen in multiple disaster-stricken areas, so multiple things can happen. Kind of like California, we can have flooding, we can have earthquakes, we can have mudslides, we can have fires, we can have about everything, but well, we even have tsunamis. We have had tsunamis recently in California. So you need to worry about how you set up. You don't want to set up in the low spot of the ground because that's going to flood, for example. You want to get a high spot. You want to be somewhere it's dangerous there that you have physical security and perimeter security around your facility and things like that. So you do need to worry about the environment you're in, and sometimes we need other specialists like security people. Like in Haiti, I was escorted around with armed guards, military 82nd Airborne, Army armed guards. In Katrina, they were shooting around and looting around us, and so we had an Air Force security detachment with us there with weapons. We didn't carry weapons, but others did. That answer your question?
Yeah, but is there training that's done beforehand,
Yeah.
or is it done on top and you have to shut it down and train people?
Yeah, so I train my people to what to expect and how to deal with that, but a lot of times when we deploy out to disaster to do this, other people come and join our merry band, and we have them help us deploy the network out further, and they may not be trained, so we have kind of OJT on job training, or some of them go out and they're not trained, and then something happens and they ask for help or something like that. It's kind of a variety of ways this turns out, yeah.
Are these networks considered like highly detectable, highly visible, building like a digital footprint that's very easy to follow?
Yep, RF, radio frequency, you can't hide it, physics. So Wi-Fi is 2.4 gigahertz. There are sensors, you can download free sensors onto your laptop right now and sense the Wi-Fi access point in this room. The WiMAX you can tell, the satellite connection you can tell. So you do have to worry about your electronic signature in some cases. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just curious what the timeline is for Hurricane Katrina, when you were up and running. I think of Hurricane Katrina and I think of communication breakdown. I
Right,
don't think of,
right.
timely response and stuff like that. So just out of curiosity, where did you come in terms of timing and
Sure.
possibly what went wrong outside of the services that you were providing?
Yeah, sure, I'll answer that question. But there is a complete timeline. on that website under a tab called Timeline that describe our activities from the day here at NPS that we started packing up
Right?
to the days we started, well, I flew there and did a site survey and started to get the ball rolling, but the rest of our team rented a U-Haul and took our 33-foot RV and started driving across the country a few days after the storm. I got there like 3 or 4 days after, and my team got there 5 or 6 days after. We just had to drive across the country, and our RV's transmission broke, went over a pass, mountain pass, and that delayed them. But then once we got there with the equipment, within 4 hours, we had a hospital online with a Wi-Fi cloud and access to the internet within 4 hours. And then we started to expand the network out after that. It took us a couple of weeks to expand it into the Bay St. Louis and Waveland multiple clouds that you'll see on the Google Earth map here pretty soon. But that's a good question, is how long does it take to get there? And we want to get there faster. We want to be able to get there in 24 hours. And there are some communication IT assessment teams that are geared to get there in 24 hours. Sometimes in disasters, you just can't get there that fast because either the transportation industry shut down, or they don't have the clearance from the country, or they don't have a warm and fuzzy that they're going to be secure when they go in, and that delays them. That delayed us in Haiti, for example, waiting on the USNS Comfort Hospital ship for a few days while we made sure that we would be safe when we were in town, and lining up our armed guards and security. I think I dwelled enough on this yet. Let's go back to PowerPoint. You can just go down to the screen. At the bottom.
What's that?
At the bottom of the screen to pull up the screen. Yeah. Next, 2 over. There you go.
Yeah.
Okay, and remember I talked about improvisation earlier? All the 9 pieces of the puzzle, we need to consider improvisation. We need to improvise, like the duct tape example. Next slide. So I'm going to skip this video in the interest of time, and that I'm using my Wi-Fi hotspot on my cell phone, and I'm not sure how well the video will come out, but you can go to the website and see this video on the NPS video server if you're interested. So, past and present activities. We did the tsunami in Southeast Asia. I was in Thailand when I first started doing this back in early 2005. And I've done exercises in Thailand, Philippines, Hawaii, California, Pacific Northwest, lots of places.
Is this exercise is training locals or just for yourselves too?
And locals,
Yeah.
local early responders, international responders. In fact, we have training with UN and NGOs before. And we were reading industry, because industry is a key player in disaster response. For example, if we had an earthquake here in California and our telecommunications infrastructure was down, we're going to need help from AT&T, and we're going to need help from Cal-Am, the water company, and PG&E, the power company, to help get the infrastructure back up. So we try and get everybody who's involved in a proper response to be familiar with the procedures and the equipment and the problems that they come up with, and then try and prepare for those before the disaster happens. That's why we're training. Down the 2 hospitals. The Navy has, U.S. Navy has 2 hospital ships, big white tankers converted into hospitals, 1,000-bed hospitals, deployed on those for humanitarian missions in the past. Then Katrina, then Haiti, then most recently, that isn't on this slide, is we responded to Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, which was the biggest storm to hit mankind in modern times, about 200 miles per hour, slamming into many islands in that country. And so we responded out there, and that had the similar kind of destruction that the earthquake in Haiti did, but things were blown sideways instead of flat. So it was interesting to see the differences there. Next slide. So Hurricane Katrina, I'll get a little bit more into that. Next slide. So you might remember the eye of the storm came roaring through Mississippi, Harrison County, Mississippi. We deployed right next door in Hancock County, Mississippi, because we were asked by Fleet Numerical over by the airport here, Navy weather facility over by the airport, to help figure out why their sister organization, Navy Oceanography Center in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, was not communicating with them. They couldn't get a hold of them at all. And they're the two organizations that provide all the weather for the Navy and our allies around the world with big supercomputers. So I flew down there and drove to find this organization called Navy Oceanography Center at Stennis Space Station, and got there and found the captain, and he and his team were trying to dig out of the rubble and the flood that happened, because 5 feet of the first floor of the whole building was flooded. And he said, we're okay. We got equipment coming in tomorrow for getting us back up communicating. So I was retasked to go over and find the Emergency Operations Center director at a school there in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi. And he said, what we really need is a hospital to come back up online. Can you go help the hospital get online? So that's what we did. Next slide. But here's what we found when we did our assessment. Nothing worked. None of the normal infrastructure was working. This was the same in Taklamayan, of course. It was the same in the earthquake in Haiti. Sandy. So you remember the puzzle, next slide. So wouldn't some of those things in that puzzle be handy about now? So that SATCOM reach back, we went in, we set that up, we started setting up Wi-Fi clouds, and then WiMAX links, and powering things up with alternate power, so that we could do the applications on the second half of that screen there. Next slide. So this is Bay St. Louis in the upper right, Waveland, Mississippi down in the lower left. So we were assigned to go to the hospital. So that green circle is a Wi-Fi cloud we created around the hospital, which, by the way, had been inundated with 5 feet of storm surge water, and there was a nearby chemical treatment plant and a nearby sewage treatment plant. So if you can imagine what the condition around that hospital, which was the only hospital in the county that sort of survived, the conditions they were in, and they couldn't communicate with anybody. So FEMA came in and they set up a big fence around the hospital. The DMAT, the DMORT, the ambulance service, the Air Force communication team, the Air Force MASH unit, and other FEMA and other organizations set up inside of this fence, and none of them were able to communicate either. So we came in with our big satellite dish, put it on the roof of the hospital, created a Wi-Fi cloud, and now everybody could start to use their own devices to communicate. Next, click. The yellow line is a WiMAX link. Talked about that point-to-point bridge earlier. So we went from the hospital down to the police and fire station and city hall area, set up a Wi-Fi cloud. Next click. Then we took a WiMAX hop over to an elementary school that had been turned into a Red Cross shelter, where you saw that earlier slide with the people sitting at the table, and put a Wi-Fi cloud there. And notice you got 3 Wi-Fi clouds, 3 green circles, but 1 red arrow up. That's 1 satellite dish is providing internet connectivity to 3 different physical locations linked by that WiMAX. That's the power of the WiMAX point-to-point stuff. Next click. So next click. So we got another satellite dish and set it up on a top of a shipping container that the Waveland Police Department had turned into their police station because the police station was destroyed, and created a Wi-Fi cloud around them. Across the street from them was a Walmart and Kmart parking lot. We set up both of those parking lots with Wi-Fi clouds because that's where the victims, the early responders, all the agencies ended up congregating. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry if this is a question you answered before, but what's the radius of the cloud?
So it depends. You know, everybody in IT likes to say it depends. This is a Wi-Fi access point here. We put up on a telephone pole, and then we put a couple of antennas on it. And this access point, instead of 100 meters like this guy will do, this will do 500 meters, each one of these. 500 meter radius. So we put one of these over there, and over there, and over there, and they all have overlapping green circles and they create a bigger and bigger mesh. But you notice on that slide there, there's nothing down below here.
Yeah.
There's nothing there. We're only providing connectivity where those circles are. Anybody know why?
That's where nothing left.
That's why what?
There's nothing left.
That's right. There were houses and buildings that were completely wiped down to the cement slab everywhere there. Nobody was there. Nothing was there. All the people were congregating around these parking lots and schools and fire stations and stuff like that. So we didn't need to worry about providing coverage everywhere, which is good for us because we have limited resources and time and people. Okay? Oh,
One more
question.
question, Peter's never gonna invite me back.
No,
It's not technical.
no, more the better.
I'm just, so you started with the question that came from Fleet, or what, you came in to figure out why the station wasn't responding. You
Yep.
came in and you started doing that. So were you called in by the government specifically, or did you just start getting to work knowing that it's what needed to be done?
So guess who actually called me in and paid for us to go? Lynn Wells, when he was the DOD chief
Oh, that's
information
awesome.
officer. So the whole thing started with Lynn. It's all his fault.
That's cool, goes full circle.
So he worked at the Office of Secretary of Defense
Mhm.
in the Network and Integration Office. He was the director. And disaster relief communications was in his area of responsibility. Well, he knew what I did in the tsunami in Southeast Asia because we knew each other already. And he said, hey, if somebody wants you to go, I have money. It happened to be end of the year sweep up money time. With the government, there's always end of the year sweep up money. You guys familiar with that? We have to spend it or lose it. That's us, government, guilty. We were asked by Navy, and we worked for Navy to go. Then the Navy turned us over to the EOC director, the Emergency Operations Center director, to take orders from him at the ground, on the ground. We were still working under our admiral here at NPS and under the directors at Office of Secretary of Defense. So we had several masters at different levels, which was difficult to deal with sometimes. And one of them says you need to come home now, and the other one says, no, you can't go yet because you're providing communications. And then 5 weeks into the disaster, the governor, Governor Barber, said, I want all active duty military, I want all Title 10 personnel out of my state within 24 hours. What? Why? He didn't answer that question. We suspect it's because he wanted people to see that he could handle it internally, and he wanted to get companies from his state to start rebuilding stuff so he could get tax revenue from those companies and all that. So we were asked to leave. They said you can either leave with your equipment or without your equipment. Well, if we left with our equipment, then everybody would be down and dead again, and there would be no communications. If we left without our equipment, nobody would be there to maintain it, so it would go down anyhow. So bottom line is, remember Lieutenant General Honore was the National Guard general in charge of the whole response. We got on the horn with him and the mayors and police chiefs of these two cities and talked him into talking to the governor to give us another couple weeks to transition the network over, which is what we did. So that was a key part of the timeline, that whole exit strategy, which is very important, your exit strategy from a disaster zone, no matter what your organization is. You need to know what constitutes your being able to and ready to leave and when. Like the military, our goal is to be in and out of a disaster within 30 days. Guess how long we were in Haiti though?
Years?
5 months. Yeah, Haiti was a different disaster than anything else. Next slide. So some of our lessons learned, these are just some of them. We have a whole paper, and there's all kinds of papers on Katrina lessons learned, but our lessons learned, key ones were right here. So the president didn't know what the situation was like on the ground here and in New Orleans and everywhere else because there was no communication. So he didn't have situational awareness. I told you earlier about how the police and fire have to have their voice comms, and they didn't. So we came in and we were the heroes because we were handing them phones that worked and satellite phones that worked. And the satellite phone also mega tricks. Catch.
Don't mess that up, yeah.
So those are worth their weight in platinum. You can communicate anywhere in the world with those. you know, on a battery that lasts a few days. It's like your cell phone on steroids. Very important device for voice communications. Push-to-talk radio. I'm talking about UHF and VHF. We have a ham in here, you're familiar with that stuff. But police and fire, you always hear their radios going in their cars and pushing their buttons. That's called push-to-talk radio. And that interoperability of that, even on 9/11, they didn't have interoperable systems, which means that they couldn't talk to each other. And that still happens today, all over our country and all over the world, when multiple agencies show up in a disaster zone and try and use their radios. Pre-positioning assets and contracts. I say you can't negotiate the chaos. It's hard to get new SIMs for that VGAN if you can't call General Services Administration and order up a new SIM, or call the company and order up a new SIM when communication doesn't work. So it's a chicken and egg thing. And the last thing there was early responders in communications don't really think about getting the general public, the victims, back online, but they're as important as anybody else. They need to get a hold of their families in other states and tell them they're alive. They need to get a hold of their insurance company and start to rebuild their life with insurance claims. And they need to call the government and get their, I lost my social security card, I lost all my identification, I can't even go to the bank to get money because it's all destroyed here. So they need to worry about that too. Next. So next, the hospital ship. So we've used these hospital ships in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. So HADR, humanitarian assistance / disaster relief. They're interesting platforms for both. There's a CH-60 helicopter pad on the hospital ship, this 1,000-bed hospital. There's some big boats there. That's the way you get victims and bodies and body bags and doctors and nurses in both directions. Next slide. So the earthquake in Haiti. Next slide. We first embarked on one of those hospital ships. Flew down to Guantanamo Bay commercial, and then helicopter from Guantanamo Bay down to an aircraft carrier off the coast of Haiti, then from an aircraft carrier on a helicopter over to the Comfort Hospital ship, and we were there the first few days. My team from NCS, students like you, and we were there for a few days while they were getting the security situation squared away ashore. Then we were at the American Embassy for a few weeks, embedded with the joint task force that was setting up there. And then I stayed a lot longer. I was there almost 3 months. I stayed a lot longer, and I embedded myself out in town with the non-government organizations, the NGOs, to see how they were operating and see what difficulties they had getting a hold of the hospital ship and getting a hold of everybody else and communicating. That's part of my research. Next. So there's my team boarding the helicopter at Gitmo. Next. There's the Comfort Hospital ship from their aircraft flying in with Haiti in the background. Okay, this is the fantail, the back outside deck of that big white hospital ship that you saw. The white ship with the red cross. What's wrong with this picture? Anybody know? What's that?
Is that a gun?
It's a 50 caliber gun. Big one. That's the world we live in. You know, there's criminal elements in Haiti that were a threat to these ships. There were desperate people ashore there who were trying to swim out from on the ship and be rescued. So, in a war zone, in a danger zone, you have to have aircraft and boats surrounding your key assets and weapons on the boat to protect yourself. So that's what that was about. Next slide. So this is the palace in Port-au-Prince, the capital of Haiti. It used to be about 6 or 7 stories. And you see it's down to 1 story. Completely collapsed. I took this picture in a vehicle with 82nd Airborne providing my security, by the way. And on my right, the other side of this street, was about 60 to 80,000 people, victims, living in a big park under tarps and plywood sheets. A lot of them lost their homes. Those that didn't want to go back in their homes because they saw all the homes collapsed around them and people, dead and dying in these collapses. So they were afraid to go back indoors. They were very desperate. It was very hot there, very humid. no food, no water, little shelter, no medicine, no sanitation. So it was a bad situation all the way around. But we had to get in there and do communication, so my team went to the grass there at the palace and set up the first node. We began a Wi-Fi access point and some solar, and started to grow our capacity after that. There, next slide. This is a typical street that had been cleared, believe it or not. They cleared the middle of the street, but everything else was totally wrecked and destroyed. This slide, I like to point out the telecommunications infrastructure and what you can imagine happens to telecom infrastructure in a major earthquake or disaster like a typhoon or a cyclone or tsunami. Telecommunications infrastructure is not going to work. So we're going to bring this stuff in. Next slide. This was a hospital, 5 or 6 story hospital. Still collapsed, still bodies underneath there. Haiti is so poor that they can't afford to rebuild. So, and there'll probably be a lot of buildings around Haiti that will stay this way, unfortunately. Next slide. So this is the this is the UN facility at the airport. There's my guy sitting on the satellite terminal at the UN peacekeeping operations at the airport. Next slide. This is the U.S. Embassy. Didn't have scratch on it. Anybody know why? We're just lucky.
Because it's built for special stuff.
Yeah, it's built to U.S. standards. Nothing else in Haiti was built to U.S. standards. They didn't use rebar, and they didn't have earthquake inspections and all that kind of stuff. Next slide, you'll see the embassy in the background with me sitting down with my headset on my laptop, talking on Skype to Washington and a couple other places on a conference call while my guy was setting up the network with the embassy in the background and my tent where I was living right there behind me. So that's the condition sometimes you have to enjoy. Nice hospital, or nice accommodations.
Right, quick question. So, because you mentioned, and I was thinking about this before, how are you setting up secure comms? So like if you're talking to,
Encrypted, secure, that kind of
yeah,
security?
like is it, so that for sensitive communications and what.
Right, so most communications, yeah, it's a good question. Most communications in HADR, Humanitarian Systems Disaster Relief Mode, is unclassified. But on the occasions where you're talking about troop movement or food or water convoys the UN are doing, you want to have your communications encrypted and secure. So there's
Yeah, because they can be
radio.
included and stuff.
Yeah, so you have radio with encryption devices. This stuff can be encrypted. But for the most part, in HADR mode, we're unclassified and wide open.
So there's this whole separate set.
Yeah.
step.
Yes, and the military brings that in. That's how they normally operate, is in secure mode, not unclassified mode. Okay? So you remember that diagram of Katrina in Mississippi earlier, set up something very similar to that in Haiti, but we're using the hospital ship with a satellite on it as well. Off the coast. Next slide. So this is the outside of a hospital there. They had overgrown their 100-bed hospital, and we're setting up, hospital rooms outside under tarps. And families were looking at their brothers and sisters and relatives and friends that were injured and trying to find them. Next slide. This is the courtyard inside the hospital. We adopted this hospital because we wanted to see how a hospital that had no UN or US presence was communicating, and this is how we found it. No communications. They didn't even have a satellite phone. Cell phones didn't work. The landlines definitely didn't work. And they had people dying there on a daily basis of crush wounds that we're trying to get them out to the comfort hospital ship so they could get help, but they didn't know how to get a hold of the ship. So we showed up and we had on our big white van, USNS Comfort hospital ship, and so they said, yeah, there's a hospital ship's here. So we facilitated them getting some medevacs out to the ship, and we actually directly participated in saving 4 people's lives that needed to get out to the ship within hours or they would die. So we used our vehicle as an ambulance because there were no ambulances that survived. Drove down to the embassy to the helo pad and flew 4 different people out to the ship in time to survive over the course of a few weeks. Next slide. So international volunteers at the hospital. The Army guy there is a Haitian-born Army Lieutenant Colonel, who was translating for us. Next slide. This is the port of Haiti. I'm almost done. This is the port of Haiti with the containers and the cranes fell into the water, so the whole port was disabled, which means that ships couldn't bring in supplies and bulldozers and food and water and shelter and medicine because the port was closed. So they set up a U.S. Coast Guard detachment, 120-person Coast Guard detachment down there to provide security while the Navy Seabees and others started to rebuild this to get it up to the point where they could at least get ships in, because there was only one airstrip working in the country, and that's how everything was coming and going. So they did that. And we provided the Wi-Fi cloud for the Coast Guard team there. And we even showed them the Super Bowl on Super Bowl Sunday, and we were their heroes because they had the Super Bowl there over the internet. Next. And I'm going to stop there and take one or two questions, and I'm going to turn it over to Eric. Yes, ma'am?
So this is all well and good, but what about the scenario, like your kind of catastrophic scenario of like EMP?
So EMP, anybody not know what EMP is? Electromagnetic pulse, that's when a nuclear explosion happens over the ground. It sends out an electromagnetic wave of energy that can destroy electronics. Some of this stuff can be hardened to survive an EMP, but most of it won't. But in an EMP event, we have bigger problems than communicating. When you got, a nuclear explosion happening, fallout, and, the destruction that comes with that. So Armageddon, we prefer not to look at. But it is a concern, and it is something that the military is very worried about taking action to be able to survive.
Do you feel that there's a potential for device mesh networks, like cell phones talking directly to cell phones to get communications out of a disrupted area?
Yeah, so we bring in cellular clouds.
No, I mean just like my cell phone directly meshing a network with hers and then bridging out to something wider.
Yeah, so there are some applications that do that. That's a pretty good local communications application to communicate locally, which is important. But you really want to communicate locally and out, so you need to have somebody tied to the broadband internet backbone to maximize the effectiveness of the cellular phone. But cell phones are good for surveillance. They're good for, with cell phone, smartphone with Skype showing the damage. It's pretty powerful. Or a laptop turned around to show the damage over a video is pretty powerful. So that kind of stuff can happen with cell phones. They're good. Other questions? Yes, sir.
For like a smaller scale deployment, like if you just wanted to send somebody with some of this equipment in to respond, I don't know how, I'm sure a couple of those pieces are trade controlled so that not all. But even like dual use, they go into like try to respond to a. Okay, good. I'll form better, but we can talk afterward.
Okay.
But
Okay. Sure. Yes, sir.
I was just curious, is there a maximum number of WiMAX links you can set up?
There's a theoretical limit to your bandwidth, but we have multiple hops and multiple WiMAX access or WiMAX bridges out there. We've never maxed out, but theoretically, they're fairly expandable. And I don't know of anybody that's expanded them so much that they didn't work. Question or? Yes, ma'am.
Wi-Fi, how are you seeing that as a possible? Wi-Fi is using, instead of Wi-Fi, you're using light, right? And,
Yeah, so.
the infrared light to create bigger bandwidth, and some people have said that this may be, there are problems with it, that this may be a great thing in catastrophes, so how do you?
Yeah, so I was on the board of the free space optics company that does that, provides fiber or optical links, and that technology is not quite mature enough to be practical. For one thing, atmospheres disrupted, and sandstorms and heavy rain, snow. So it's got limited use. It definitely can't be the only means of communication. It could augment your others because it's really tight if you can get the connection.
Yeah, we just saw this Japanese one that, it doesn't work in sandstorms, but it does work in snow and rain, or, moving bird or something. But it's just, as you say, it's so nascent, I didn't know if anyone was really looking into it, implementing it or adding
Yeah, they
it.
are looking into it.
Yeah, have you added it yet or not yet?
Yeah. Other faculty than the others that in that. One last question? Yes.
I know that, the other day, we were talking about star tides, and it was mentioned that that organization doesn't want to own equipment. I guess they want to task other groups, and so what, and it was also mentioned that they're looking more for like policy at the school, similar to this, for policy type people to start to participate or begin to just be trained or be prepared. What, maybe you did this at the very end or now, but, what type of things would individual organizations need to do, like a response, like a local Red Cross chapter or, some sort of campus communities? What could we do to be prepared or to start down that path?
So, to be self-sustaining for communications or to go augment communication teams or?
Even to begin to participate in star tides, I guess either or what's needed, or are there things that are needed, or are you looking for other organizations to participate on a?
Yeah, so we're looking for other organizations, we're looking for individuals that want to possibly deploy out to the next disaster, to be able to join the team. I made that offer last time to the class when I spoke, and a couple students got back to me, but we hadn't had any disasters between then and now, so, except Typhoon Haiyan, they couldn't make it to that. But that's one thing.
But you're able to take students without any liabilities?
Oh, no, there's all kinds of liability.
No, I imagine universities coming out over, yeah.
Yeah, we have to work through all that and associate you with somebody else that's going out that we're working with if we have to. But there are those opportunities. There are also local opportunities for getting involved with this kind of thing. So CAL FIRE, the state's wildland fire department that's statewide, has a very active local CAL FIRE operation that has a program that allows communications people who are volunteers to come in and help augment their teams setting this stuff up. And they love ham operators, and in fact, getting a ham license is one of the things that you get out of that, in addition to learning how to operate in the middle of a fire zone. But they're looking for volunteers to do this kind of stuff. The Red Cross is trying to increase their capabilities to do this stuff. So crisis response teams locally are looking for people. So there's a lot of different opportunities to get more involved in this out there. Internships with Star Tides is a possibility. Am I answering your question, I hope?
I think so.